Hello, Claudia. How are you today?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thanks. It's really great to see you again. And it's only been a week.
We'll pretend last week didn't happen.
Okay. I'll just share with everybody that we did a lovely interview last week and I didn't press record properly, so we did not get any of our footage with sound. Pretty funny. Anyway, I've been thinking a lot since last time we chatted about how we came to know each other and some of the things that came back to me we didn't chat about last week. We met in the Canadian Children's Opera Chorus, and then we hung out a little bit, and I came to visit you at your house, and we played games and sang songs, and you had some gerbils or something that we played with, those lovely little things. But also, after I moved away, we became pen pals for a little while. I don't know if you remember writing letters, and yeah, that was neat. And then somehow we got back in touch a little bit later, and I think we went to a production of Pagliacci together. This would have been a long time ago when COC mounted it for the first time since 1975, and so we went. It was so fun.
I don't remember that, but I do remember being in E Pagliacci with you in whatever year that was, or maybe you weren't in that production. I was did it
Yes.
with the Canadian Children's Opera Chorus.
Yeah, we were in that, and it was 1975. Yeah,
Right.
gosh, that's a long time ago. Okay, we won't go there. Anyway, I also remember that you sent me a box of things. At one point, you had been cleaning out the house and you found a whole bunch of those old pen pal letters. So you sent them back to me, and that was sort of a neat treasure to
Oh,
unpack and find. So thank you for doing that. Claudia, your father was an incredible person and a wonderful composer, a charming and extraordinary man, and a musical prodigy, as I understand it. What can you tell us about where he grew up and how he first came into studying music and then where did he study?
well, he was born in a very small town called Svetla nad Sázava, which is about an hour east of Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, which I guess at that time was Bohemia because he was born in 1917, right in the middle of the First World War.
Mm.
Yeah, so when he was about 6 years old, I think his mother said, "Come, Oscar, there's a woman here who wants to teach you to play the piano." And he thought, "Oh, great, somebody's going to show me how to play the piano, and then I'll know how to play the piano." And that was that. But then he discovered, no, it's not that simple.
Not in one lesson.
Yeah, that's right. But he really took to the music. He played, he really loved the piano. And in fact, his older brother was also taking piano lessons, and his older brother was very competitive and said, "If Oscar passes me, then I quit." And very
Oh,
soon he quit.
oh dear.
But my father, he didn't like to practice. He liked to sight read, and he read and read and read music. And this frustrated a lot of his piano teachers because, of course, they want you to perfect a piece until it's lovely so they can show off their lovely students. But
Yeah.
my father just read, and he also, I think he developed perfect pitch. And actually, there's a funny story about that. I think one of his very early piano teachers wanted to impress him and show him about perfect pitch. He said, "Okay, Oscar, play a note in the piano and I'll tell you what it is." And so he did. And my father was not impressed. He couldn't figure out, well, what's the big deal? I can do that. And the teacher said, "Okay, well, you try." So she turned him around and played some notes, and he could name them as well. So that's how he discovered he has perfect pitch.
Incredible.
Yeah. And yeah, so, but when he was about 10, I guess they moved back to Prague permanently because he had to go to school, or his older brother was at school, and he took lessons at the Prague Conservatory. And he had a piano teacher called Karl Hofmeister who was quite happy to let him do lots of sight reading. And so that sort of let him, read lots of different music. I remember at that time they didn't have CDs and tape recorders like we do to listen to music. So if you wanted to, hear what an opera sounded like, you read the piano score so you could
Hmm.
hear what the music sounded like. And he just, consumed music that way.
He could hear it and while he was looking at the notes, which is an incredible gift.
Well, that came much later, but I mean, even just when he was younger, just reading through lots of music, just to become familiar with a lot of the literature.
Yeah.
There were a lot of piano reductions, like I think in Europe, because there was not TV and all that stuff, they had, and you had to go to a performance if you wanted to hear an opera. So they would make piano reductions so you could actually play them at home. And
Yeah.
he learned symphonies and operas through reading these piano reductions.
Wow. And when he was in Vienna, then that's when World War II started, right? And he had to leave in a hurry.
Yeah, so I mean, World War II didn't actually officially start, I guess, until September 39. He was actually in Vienna in 1937. But I mean, I guess Hitler invaded Austria, and so my father had to flee back to Czechoslovakia. And then in December of 38, he thought, okay, well, I'll go to Paris and study. And they thought, oh, Paris is fine, everything's safe there. They've got the Maginot Lines, nobody will ever invade there. And in fact, in early 1939, things were getting very difficult in Czechoslovakia. And so his parents, my grandparents, managed to get a ship that was sailing to America, and asked Oskar, my father, if he wanted to come with them. And he said, why would I want to go to America? It's a big wasteland. There's no music there. I'm having a great time here in Paris. I'll just stay in France. And 6 weeks later, things got very bad. Well, I guess that's then, yeah, I guess uh, Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, and suddenly Czechoslovakia was not a country anymore. And so my father, stuck in France, was laughed at because, oh, you're a citizen of a country that doesn't exist, and he couldn't take out money out of the bank, and he couldn't travel anywhere. And so he basically took a trip all the way to Cherbourg, which is on the west coast of France, to say goodbye to his parents, who were going to take the ship to America. And he thought he would never see them again. And he was in a very difficult situation. And so, yeah, so then came a real trial to try and get out of Europe, essentially. I mean, he stopped studying. It was mostly, he was at first trying to get a visa to go to Portugal, but he had to go through Spain, which was an ally of Hitler's. That wouldn't have worked. And then he eventually took a sleeper train to Italy. He got a visa to Italy for 2 weeks. It was a 2-week visa,
Mhm.
but he had to get out of France. And when he got onto the train, he tipped the conductor very heavily so when they got to the border, he would not be disturbed. But when they got to the border, the conductor couldn't stop the border guards coming on, and they turned to my father and said, "What religion are you?" And my father was half asleep because he'd been asleep on the train, and the conductor quickly said, "Oh, he's Catholic, of course." And my father didn't correct him, and that was how he learned that you don't always obey authority. I mean, that sort of saved his life. And then he was in Genoa, Italy for, I can't remember how many months now, but way past his 2-week visa. He was there essentially illegal, trying to get out of Europe. And what got it, what was able to get a ship that would sail from the Canary Islands into America, but he didn't want to take a boat to Canary Islands because he had heard that there were U-boats in the Strait of Gibraltar, which were sinking ships. So he flew to the Canary Islands and then basically on to America, and that's how he got out. But it was a harrowing experience. So it was about 2 years of trying to run from place to place and escape. He had some very harrowing experiences getting into
Right.
America.
And then from there, he wanted to come into Canada to be with his family, but he encountered some resistance from an official, as I understand it.
Yeah, so the director of immigration of Canada at the time, his name was Frederick Charles Blair, and he was very anti-Semitic. He was determined not to let any Jews into Canada,
Hmm.
and there's a book written about him called "None is Too Many," and basically referring to, he actually said this phrase that how many Jews should we let into Canada, and his answer was none is too many. So
Wow.
he made things very, very difficult for my father. I mean, he basically, when my father was in Italy, he said, "Oh yes, sure, Oscar can travel to America if he first passes a medical exam in London, England." Well, how was he supposed to get to London, England?
Hmm.
And anyway, finally, I think his father, who was already in America, worked through another lawyer to try and get him out there, past this immigration director. But yeah, he did not make it easy for my father.
Wow. Yeah, what a story. And only 5,000 to be allowed in. That just seems so, I mean, that is not enough to make a difference at all, given what was going on in Europe.
Yeah.
So he was very, very lucky. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, my father's family, apart from his parents and his sisters and brothers, he lost cousins and uncles and aunts. Many of them perished in concentration camps and during the war.
Yeah.
So they were very lucky to get out.
Wow. And so then once he was settled in Toronto and safely with his family, Did he begin to compose right away?
Well, he actually thought he was going to become a pianist. When he was graduated from high school, in Europe at the time, my grandfather was a big businessman. He owned a textile factory. And at Europe at the time, the oldest son was expected to take over the business of their father. And that was my father's brother was going to take over the business. And my father, his role was supposed to be to take over the forestry, take care of the lands at Svetla, where he was born.
Right.
And my father actually studied forestry for a year, but just was not into this at all. And my grandfather could see that. And so that's why he let him study in Paris. But so when he was studying, my father, when they came to America, my grandfather, there's no forest to look after anymore. So I guess he sort of conceded, well, I guess you could, pursue your studies in music. And he had thought that he was going to become a pianist. And actually, I can tell you a story, but that's interesting as well. When he thought he was going to be a pianist, and he was in doing his studies it was actually the Royal Conservatory at the time. Part of his undergraduate degree, he had to write little compositions to pass his degree.
Okay.
And he was terrible at it. He said he couldn't compose. He just wasn't good at it. He was really slow. And so he thought, okay, well, the one thing I'm going to do to try and get better is he set himself the task, I'm going to write one fugue per week.
Okay.
And he said that at first it was painfully slow, but after doing it, just like anything, repetition makes practice makes perfect, right? He got faster and faster, and eventually was able to produce these quite quickly. And in fact, his first composition was a string quartet.
Wow.
And so that's when he sort of thought, oh well, maybe I could actually do this as a composer, and that's when he started thinking about doing composition.
Huh. And he went on to win many awards with his works, and a lot of them were premiered by some very famous people. I wondered whether you have any particular memories of some of those people from your childhood.
Oh well, we had I was sort of tag along with my dad. We had a lot of receptions in our home after concerts, and I also went with my father to a lot of performances, not just of his works, but other things. And my father was very good at networking. He'd meet musicians backstage, and he was always good at telling some stories and engaging with these people. And yeah, so I met a lot of these well-known musicians. Yo-Yo Ma was actually in our house in 1977 before anybody had heard about Yo-Yo Ma. Judith Forrest, who I think you spoke with last week and who has sung the Diary of Anne Frank a number of times, was a lovely person, and she actually came to visit my father when he was in hospital at the end of his life. Maureen Forrester was a very good friend. She's a wonderful mezzo soprano. And Hannah and Karl Anschel. Karl Anschel was the conductor of the Toronto Symphony for many, many years, and he was also from the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia at the time, and they were very good friends. And Anton Querdy also, we went to his cottage in Parry Sound many times, and he's a pianist, as you know, and he was very, very good friends with my father. So, oh, and I should mention one other thing, that Erica Goodman, she's a harpist in Toronto, and when my father wrote his harp concerto, he wrote it so that Erica Goodman could premiere it. He didn't know much about the harp, and the harp, it has like I think 12 pedals and lots of strings. It's a complicated instrument. And my father never wanted to approach writing anything unless he really understood the instrument. And so he went over to visit Erica Goodman a number of times, and she showed him how the pedals work, I don't remember, I was a young kid at the time, but I went with them, and that was really interesting to watch, how she showed him how the instrument worked, essentially.
Yeah,
It was
yeah,
fun.
that's very cool. And I know that you invited my Uncle Victor at one point to one of those parties as well. And I was already living in St. Catharines, and somehow you got word to my mom and so invited me over. I don't know what year this would have been, maybe 77 or 8. So I came just thinking, oh, I'm going to see Claudia and have a sleepover again. And there was my Uncle Vic, and I hadn't seen him in years. And it was such a treat. I always will remember that. I, I used to have a photograph of the two of us that evening, and I've lost it. I wish I could find it. I'm going to have to look for it.
I
But
just looked it up, 1978, but it was not me that invited. Remember, I would have only been, well, a young kid at the time. Well, as we know,
yeah,
teenagers.
yeah.
But yeah, no, that was one of the receptions that my parents would have hosted after a concert. And I think, well, Russell, your cousin Russell is also in our house. a couple times. And there was actually, I don't know if you know this, but Russell Braun actually sang one of my father's songs for some, it was some guy who wanted to do a little mini documentary on my father, and he wanted to create atmosphere. So he had this piano situated in the middle of the room, or my father's grand piano, and he put candles on the piano, and he had Russell singing, and he had the camera sort of zooming around the singers. Russell, like, you can ask him about it. We'd still laugh about that recording. It's very funny.
I think I've seen it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, very nice.
Yeah.
When The Diary of Anne Frank was first published, I know that your father didn't want to read it right away. Do you know why he waited so long?
Well, as I described before, his escape from Europe was very harrowing, and he lost a lot of relatives, and so he didn't want to relive all those memories.
Yeah.
And so he avoided the diary for many years, and I don't think he read it until in the 60s, or about 20 years after the war.
Hmm.
But when he finally did read it, he found that it was very evocative of his own feelings during the war, and he decided, I really want to set this to music.
What was your inspiration for writing these works? You had obviously read her diary.
Well, yes, I read her diary, but believe it or not, I read it much later than 99% of all other people, because it was published, I think, around 1952, and I didn't want to read it because, unfortunately, the fate of her and her family was very close to the fate of many of my relatives, whom I've never seen after the war again, and many of my school friends and other friends. So I finally read it very late, I think in 68. And I was so taken by this that I must say, the way Anne Frank, she actually, this passage which I took, strangely enough, has not been used in the movie or the theater, and I still think it's the most moving passage of the whole book. The passage actually is nothing else but a prayer for the survival of her friend Lise
Goosens.
Yeah, whom she knew since they were 4 years old. So they knew each other, 12 years. And Anne Frank wrote this text which I used. I shouldn't say text, it's a passage which I used. She wrote when she was only 14 years old. And it's so beautifully written. I can't think of any person twice her age. I couldn't write it like this even today with all the experiences I went through. It's so moving.
But then he didn't really have an opportunity. He wasn't really sure what he wanted to do, and so then, well, this leads to the story of the Diary of Anne Frank, because Sir Irving Glick, I think you know him, he's a composer as well. He was a CBC producer in the 60s, and he asked my father, he said, my father had written a piece called Land of Dreams and had orchestrated that so that Lois Marshall could sing it. And Glick asked my father if he would write a second 5-minute piece to accompany it, so it would be a 10-minute program. And so my father said, okay, so he thought this would be his opportunity to use the diary and set it to music. And he started writing it, and there were so many phrases and words in the diary that he really wanted to use, that after a while he called Sir Irving Glick and said, well, I'm really sorry, but I've written now, it's about 10 minutes long. Would it be okay? Can we just do this one piece instead of doing the Land of Dreams as well? And Glick said, okay, that's fine. And then
Hmm.
my father called a little while and said, well, actually, it's probably going to be more than 12 to 13 minutes. Is that okay? And Glick said, okay, that's fine, Oscar, but no longer. And then later on, he called and said, well, it's up to about 15 minutes now. And Glick said, well, that's going to be difficult, but we'll try and squeeze it in the program, but no longer, Oscar. And then finally, the piece is actually 19 minutes long. So
And he
he was
allowed
very,
it. Yeah.
yeah,
Very nice. I think my mother did some music copying for Srill Irving Glick as well. I remember him coming to our home and meeting with her. I remember his face. So that's pretty interesting. So your father had the work nearly complete when he realized suddenly that he needed to obtain permission to use those words in his music. So what incredible events unfolded after that?
yeah, that's another interesting story. I guess, my father had all written a lot of songs where he had, he'd set music to William Blake or Anne Wilkinson, which were poets that I think where the copyright was, it was beyond copyright, so it was okay to use that. But of
Hmm.
course, the Diary of Anne Frank was only 20, 25 years old. And so the copyright was still held by the publisher. And
Hmm.
so my father realized when the composition was almost finished, he thought, "Oh my God, I've got to get permission to use these words." And so Doubleday, they were the publisher. He wrote a sort of a business letter asking, could I use these words for my composition? And he thought, "Oh my gosh, if they say no, I'm in a lot of trouble now." And so he
Hmm.
threw away the letter and instead composed a very personal and impassioned note about how the words really moved him, and that was really important that he wanted to use these words. And then he waited and waited, and Doubleday didn't get back to him, and he got really, really nervous. I thought, oh my gosh, am I going to be able to complete this work?
Yeah.
And finally, he got a letter from Doubleday that said, well, we've received your letter, and unfortunately, we can't grant you the rights to these words. At which point, my father practically fell to the floor. But then he
Mm.
read on and said, the reason we can't grant you the rights is because the father of Anne Frank is still alive. And so we've taken the liberty of sending your letter on to Mr. Frank, who can decide whether or not to give you the permission. So my father was very glad that he'd written this very personal note. And in fact, Mr. Frank wrote back to him and gave him the permission. He said that my father had chosen a text that was also very meaningful to him as well. It was one of the most moving words from the diary. And this became a lifelong friendship and correspondence between my father and Mr. Frank until he passed away. I can't remember, it was in the late 70s or sometime.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And I understand that there was a gift that Otto gave to your father at one point.
Yeah, so on the premiere of the Diary of Anne Frank, my Mr. Frank wrote a letter to my father saying, on the occasion of the premiere, I would like to send you this silver dish, which was a wedding present to my wife and I in 1925. So you can imagine a very, very personal and special meaning to
Hmm.
them,
Yeah.
and gave it to my father, which is very, very lovely. I think my
Well,
father was very touched.
quite a legacy there. And so there was also a gentleman who spent time in the annex with the Frank family by the name of Victor Kugler, and your father also met him. Tell us how that happened.
So when my father started corresponding with Mr. Frank, he was very curious. He said, I mean, he knew that everyone in the attic had perished, all the Frank family and then the Van Dusens. But there were the people who hid the Frank family in the attic. There was Otto Frank's business associate was Victor Kugler, and he continued the business. They were hiding up in this attic in Amsterdam, and on the bottom floor was Mr. Frank's. I think he had a spice business or something like that. And Victor Kugler was one of his employees, and he agreed to hide the family. And so my father asked, "Well, what happened to this Victor Kugler, after the war?"
Hmm.
And Mr. Frank wrote back and said, "Well, he survived, and he decided to emigrate to Toronto, of all places." And so my father, of course, that's where my father lived. And so he was floored and thought, well, he invited Victor Kugler to the premiere of the Diary of Anne Frank. And Victor Kugler
Wow.
presented some flowers to Lois Marshall on behalf of Mr. Frank.
That's an incredible story. Oh my goodness. That must have been so moving. What was that passage, by the way, in the diary that was the most touching to your father?
I mean, there were many passages, but I'll just read the one because I know he spoke about it in one of the articles that he was interviewed for. The passage says, "Good Lord, if only you could tell her that I think lovingly of her and with sympathy, perhaps this would give her greater endurance."
Mm.
So, I mean, you imagine this girl, Anne Frank, she was 13, 14 years old, and in fear of being found out in this attic and being sent to a concentration camp. And yet here she was thinking about other people and what situation they were in. And
Right.
this really touched my father because he had lost many relatives during the war. And he said that, at times he would often think, oh, if I could only tell them, that I was thinking about them, this would maybe give them some comfort. So
Yes.
this really resonated with
Oh,
him. And in
yeah.
fact, this article goes on with my father was interviewed for. It says that he actually started composing some very solemn chords to this text at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and he got so lost in his memories that it was at 6:30. My mother called him down for dinner, and 4 hours had passed, and he had no idea where it had gone because he was just
Oh
thinking
dear.
about these memories.
Wow. And so that passage and most of this excerpt from the diary that your father composed music to is about Lise Goosens, her friend, Anne's friend, and she first has a vision or a dream and sees her friend Lise in the camp and all emaciated and looking, just in prison. And so this is why Anne had those feelings for her friend, and she wanted to make sure she wished that she could make things better for her, and she felt very guilty about all of that too. Here I am, I'm fine, I'm safe, and look at you. And but there's some irony in that story, isn't there, at the end of things?
Yeah. So the whole, yeah, it's true that the text that my father started was yesterday evening before I fell asleep, who should suddenly appear before my eyes but Lise? And Lise was her childhood friend. And this whole text that she talks about is thinking about Lise and other people about, what difficulty they must be in. So yeah, and then the irony about the story with Liz is that Anne was in hiding and she was writing her diary, and she was falling in love with the boy in the attic with her, and she just thought, well, we're going to sit it out throughout the war and we're going to get through this and
Mm-hmm.
survive the war when it's over. And she was very frightened for Lise and thinking, where is she? Maybe she's in a concentration camp and starving and terrified.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so the irony of all this is that, as we know, the attic was discovered by the Gestapo, and all of the Frank family and the Van Dusens went to a concentration camp. And
Mm-hmm.
when Anne, she was sent to Bergen-Belsen, and when she was there, who was there also but Lise? And Lise was on the other side of a barbed wire fence from Anne, and Anne was actually doing very badly. She was very sick. Her sister Margot had died of typhoid, and Anne looked also very sick.
Mm-hmm.
And Lise tried very hard to for the few food rations they had, to throw some food over this barbed wire fence, which is very dangerous. I mean, they could have been shot. So just give Anne a little bit of food. And the irony is that she was the one who was emaciated, and she actually died of typhoid herself, whereas Lise survived the war. So it was
Yeah.
sort of the opposite of what Anne was
Yeah.
predicting in her story or in her diary.
And so there's something also more to that story in terms of your dad and Ms. Goosens, isn't there?
Yeah, so in 1976, the Diary of Anne Frank was performed in Israel. This was, in the heart of the Jewish homeland.
Right.
And so I went with my father to Israel, and we spent 1 week in Tel Aviv, which is where the performance was going to be. And by the way, I went to all the rehearsals, and I learned that piece off by heart myself. But you will sing it 100 times better than me.
Oh, dear.
And in the second week, we went to Jerusalem to see the sights. I mean, it's the holy city. It was very interesting. But because Lise had actually moved to Jerusalem, that's where she was living. And my father tried very hard to get together with her. And he
Mm-hmm.
had contacted her before we went to Israel, and he contacted her when we arrived. And she was very reticent. She wasn't really sure she wanted to meet us. I think that she just sort of wanted to leave the whole war experience behind.
Mm-hmm.
And we were there in a week, and on the last night, my father tried one more time. He thought it was our last night here. We were going to get a chance to see her, and she finally agreed to to see us. And so we met her, and we had some. I remember we went for some very typical Israeli food. And then she actually invited us back to her home. And we had a nice chat. She's a lovely woman. And she actually gave us an article that she had written for a magazine called, the article was called I Knew Anne Frank, which tells the story about how she tells a story about their childhood friendship, but also how she met Anne in the concentration camp.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And Lisa's still alive today.
So, yeah, and I know she could be in her 90s, I would think.
Okay.
Still an older woman, but yeah.
Yeah, that's just wonderful. I can't believe it. So you did say that you've attended a performance of this music, and I wanted to know from your perspective and in remembrance of your father, would you say that this music is one of his most moving works?
Well, of course, that's a subjective question, but I can tell you that the Diary of Anne Frank and the Diary of Anne Frank and his memorial to Martin Luther King were both written around the same time, about 2 years apart, and they were both written for the plight of human suffering. So the Diary of Anne Frank, of course, for Anne and all the Jews, and the memorial of Martin Luther King was in memory of King. This was just in '68 after he had been shot, and of the racism and against Black people in the States. And so those two works, maybe because he wrote them with this vision in mind about this moving topic, they have really been performed more than any of his other works. So yes, I guess in a way you can say the most. I mean, there are a lot of other works that my father wrote that were quite moving. He wrote another work in commemoration of the war called Crucifixion, which is a choral work. He wrote. Actually, there was a violin piece which Jasper Wood just he recorded about 10 years ago. A child's what's it called? A Child from Izieu, which was a child in a concentration camp as well. So, I mean, I think my father wrote stuff that moved him, but certainly this one really resonated with the public and with his own life, I guess, as well.
What was the Martin Luther King piece orchestrated for, or written for a voice?
So that's no, not at all. That's actually very interesting. So I'll tell you the story about that. The Martin Luther King piece came about because my father met the very famous cellist Rostropovich, and Rostropovich is no longer alive. He actually ended up becoming a conductor later on, more than a cellist. But he was a fantastic cellist. And on one of his visits from Russia to North America, my father met him, and Rostropovich said to my father, "Write a piece for me, but don't write anything like a standard concerto. Make it different, an unusual orchestration, and an unusual mood, and everything had to be different." And my father thought, "Well, what do you have in mind?" And Rostropovich said, "Well, you'll think of something." So my father struggled with this for quite a few years, and then it was not until when Martin Luther King was shot, and he watched the whole procession, the funeral procession on television, that the whole idea came to him that he would write a work in the memory of Martin Luther King's life and his the march, towards freedom, and his speech, and then the shot. And in fact, in the piece, you can hear the whip, making a sudden shot. Wow. And then at the end, his favorite spiritual called "Free at Last, Free at Last, Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last." He was a spiritual which was mostly played by bands, and it was actually a upbeat thing. So my father took this and thought, "Oh, I will do an unusual orchestration by using band orchestration." So basically, it was an orchestra with no strings. So it had all the winds and the percussion and the brass, and with the soloist was a cello, the cellist, and that was the concerto. So it's basically a concerto for solo cello and orchestra devoid of strings. And that was Rostropovich's unusual scoring.
I will have to look that up. It does sound really interesting. And those two things that he chose to write about Anne Frank and Martin Luther King, it just tells me what kind of a person Oskar was. And I wonder if he were alive today, what he would think about what was going on in the world.
Yeah, so my father, a lot of people said his music is mostly depressing. It's very sad, and it's true. But and I think my father was interviewed about that once. Why is his music always about, there's nothing, not much jovial music. He wrote a few pieces, songs that were jovial, but it's mostly impassioned and moving music. And my father always said that in order to evoke emotions from people, you have to do something that's emotional. And so I think he chose these empathetic themes. And I think my father himself, he was a very empathetic person. He would watch the daily news every day, and he would always be, sort of sad about, this horrible thing happened in this country, or this person, something to this person, and all these human tragedies upset him, like the Vietnam boat people or the Rwandan genocide in the 90s. And so, I think that the diary is a real lamentation for this atrocities against the Jewish people, and the Martin Luther King was, you know, uh, a cry against the black racism in the 60s. And what do we have today? You ask, what would he think today? I don't know. What do any of us think today? I think he would find it very heartbreaking to see that 50 years later, we still have a Black Lives Matter movement, and we still have racism in North America. I think it would sadden him.
And
Yeah, it's
anti-Semitism is still here too.
yeah. I mean, to be honest, I'm glad he didn't have to live through the Trump administration.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so I think he would have been pretty saddened and pretty sickened by it, like I think we all are.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm thinking back again now on how I ended up even finding the music about Anne Frank that he wrote, and I remember asking you whether you could recommend any of the pieces that your dad wrote for me to sing. And I have right here, this is the envelope that you
Oh
sent
my
me.
gosh.
You sent me all
Wow.
the music that you thought that would fit my voice, and you included the Diary of Anne Frank in that, and that was 2015. And it percolated with me for a long time. I knew right away I had to do it somehow, but I wasn't ready back then. I didn't think vocally I was ready for it either, and uh, now I'm ready, and I'm so honored and excited to be doing this music. I think it's such an important time right now, and I just wanted to say that it's so wonderful to get to talk to you about it and hear all of these things about your dad. And I wish he was still here, that I could sing it for him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it really, it honors me as well to think that my childhood friend is singing this work of my father, which I knew so well, and my father I knew well, obviously. So it's very meaningful for me, Kira. And I think I admire your energy, and for doing the fundraising, and putting an orchestra together and learning this piece. And it's a lot of work what you're doing, and I really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing what you're going to come up with.
Me too. I guess it's just the right time in my life, to be pursuing a project like this, and really putting everything that I have into it. So yeah, yeah, I can't wait. We're really, really close now. It's going to be, either before the end of the year or by the early beginnings of 2021, that we have all of our orchestral players in place, and they'll each be recording a track, and we'll be putting it all together, and then I'll be in the studio with it. So I'll keep you posted on how we're doing.
I mean, I'm sorry that you're not going to be able to do this live, but given COVID, I mean, I think this is a good solution. But I am glad that you're doing with orchestra, because I know your original thing was that you wanted to do with piano, and I was just horrified. I know my dad would have been rolling in his grave if you decided to do it with piano.
That's funny too. Yes, yes, definitely with orchestra. And because we were meant to perform this, in fact, on Remembrance Day a few days ago, we are still going to be looking at doing it next November. So in 2021, I'll be on stage with a full orchestra and performing this work, God willing, and COVID aside. So yeah.
Well, I hope I can come. Maybe the COVID will let me actually come to Toronto. That would be
Oh,
great.
that would be wonderful. Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
Okay, well, I'll keep you posted on that too. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. I really enjoyed our conversation and all those stories about your dad. There, what an incredible life and just path that he had. It was quite circuitous, getting from over in Europe to Canada and then his composing life. So very interesting and compelling. Thanks, Claudia.
Not at all. Nice to speak with you again, Kira.